Yo, 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 DJ Shane back in the house. It's been about a year since anyone has heard this nasty voice. I've missed all of you. Today we're going to be talking about a very important topic, the ASEAN Way. So if you're up for a little musharaya and if we have muafakat on that topic, let's begin. Respect, y'all. Alright guys, it's good to be back on the airwaves again. I hope that this podcast will be useful for you. Sorry I couldn't really arrange makeup classes until everyone can attend it. I hope that this podcast will be sufficient, so let's just get into it. Guys, now I want to go into the ASEAN Way. It's a really, really important topic, and I told those who attended the classes last week that this topic is really important because no matter what SPQ you are given on ASEAN, as long as you know principles of the ASEAN Way, you can use these kind of information for your CK and things like that. But I think more important than that, the ASEAN Way series of lectures is pretty fundamental to who ASEAN is as an organization, what they stand for, their various approaches, all these things being really seminal to who they are, and their applicability lasts all the way till today. One of the key questions I keep asking is if there are so many flaws with the ASEAN Way, if there are so many limitations brought about by the ASEAN Way, the very set of approaches and principles they created, then why is it still in existence today? Why does it still form a core pillar of what ASEAN is? And in fact, why do these set of principles continue to help ASEAN thrive actually and fulfill their objectives that they set out in their various workshops or policies or forums or whatever it is? But fundamental to this whole thing is the ASEAN Way principles and how it helps ASEAN fulfill its set objectives. So if you need a guiding question, this one can be it. It shifts our focus away from what are the motivations behind the formation of ASEAN, or even shifts our focus away from what is the role of ASEAN, but now it's more of an effectiveness kind of question where we look at these set of principles and we ask ourselves, how effective are these principles in allowing ASEAN to fulfill its core functions, to fulfill its core purpose and its own conceptualizations. So is the ASEAN Way an effective means of diplomacy or mere talk shop? I think the major accusation against the ASEAN Way is that it is ineffectual, it's too passive, it doesn't amount to anything significant. Now, are all these criticisms true? We are going to be exploring these kind of things. So as we go into the ASEAN Way, maybe I would like to start off with the various criticisms. This is an SPQ topic, so you are likely to get pictorial sources. These are some of them that I've picked up across the years that focus on criticisms of the ASEAN Way. You can see in this cartoon here, I think the message is quite obvious that the ASEAN Way, the train going around in circles, I mean, it's a metaphor for it not amounting to anything significant, just going around in circles. Doesn't really lead anywhere, and you can see some of the various faces over there not particularly happy to be on board this train. I think there's a kind of disassociation between each of the member states as well. They are just following a particular leader and going around in circles. Or another criticism of the ASEAN Way is that it is a superficial kind of philosophy, of superficial diplomatic approach. You can see here that this is a mockery of the ASEAN Way handshake, but over here you can see that the sleeves are being tied together forcibly, and there's a lot of, I guess, underlying disagreement or resentment, nervousness maybe even, and so the ASEAN Way can cloud over such things without actually solving them or without actually tackling the root of the issue. So maybe that's another criticism. Another criticism, quite popular as well, is that the ASEAN Way is too passive. Basically, it turns a blind eye to the regional developments, regional conflict, regional issues, just kind of lets things play out, kind of hides under the principle of non-interference. So the principle of non-interference, we'll get into it later, but basically the criticism here is that they are using it to not intervene, this is not really seen in a positive light, but more a negative one where it's just a state of passiveness. The ASEAN Way principles, I think I mentioned quite a bit about this already. The ASEAN itself is non-binding, it's not enforceable, it doesn't seek to impose legalistic rules-based practices on the member states. So a lot of the action or the success of actions are really quite dependent upon the member states themselves. There's really nothing legal or I guess enforceable that is holding ASEAN together except for the fact that all the member states are committed or have that willingness. But in this picture you can see that it's very easy for them to basically walk out as well. And ASEAN as an organization would not be able to do anything concrete if such a scenario was to happen, except to, I guess, continue to engage those parties that are walking out. Thankfully, this hasn't happened till this date. Another criticism of the ASEAN Way principles, quite linked to the fact that it's not passive. It's also, it also presents an association that it's I guess weak against external powers. The image that you see over here is that while there may be a brave front, while maybe there may be a front of collective strength, but actually all the members are either scared or actually you can see the fish over here, the ASEAN fish. There's nothing actually holding them together. So the next cartoon that follows up from this is actually all the various fish swimming away when they meet China. So ASEAN Way, a lot of it, just now you saw the question, is it a talk shop? So a lot of ASEAN approaches rest on dialogue and consultation and going through the diplomatic process. But with a party like China, who is more bent on physical assertion or just basically doing whatever they want to do, is this really the best approach? Is this the most aligned approach towards meeting them? So here you can see ASEAN members are saying, hey, look at us, embrace the code of conduct and let's abide by international law and all that kind of stuff, and China's the dragon basically just grabbing whatever it wants. In this case, I think the cartoon is even more severe. It's the same issue with the South China Sea, but here you see ASEAN, the organization, reaching out to its members as well, which suggests that in the South China Sea issue in particular, the member states themselves are not fully abiding by the ASEAN diplomatic approach. So again, what does that say about the ASEAN Way if countries like the Philippines and Vietnam don't even abide by it? So is there relevance to the ASEAN Way principles? Is it effective? Is it the most appropriate? And so on and so forth. So by this point in time, I think you can get a sense that the ASEAN Way principles are a core philosophy, a core diplomatic philosophy for ASEAN to function. It is what we call norms setting. So the biggest value of the ASEAN Way as a diplomatic philosophy is that it moderates or it guides the behavior of states in the region. Now, what kind of behavior are they moderating? What kind of behavior are they guiding? It's the conduct of relations between states in the region, so to ensure regional stability. So ASEAN isn't there to stop conflict from happening, or ASEAN isn't there to solve all the regional issues, but this ASEAN Way set of principles is meant as a blanket guide for countries who are in dispute or who are approaching an issue to have a set of common behavior when they enter the dialogue table, so that these kind of things can be soothed over, or there can be further progress and development pertaining to whatever the issue is. It's a unique formula that is more akin to Southeast Asian styles of governance and interaction. So in the West, with institutions like the UN, ICJ, NATO, EU, so on and so forth, they are what we call rules-based legalistic organizations. So they are rules-based legalistic organizations. They operate on a lot of structure, they operate on a lot of hierarchy, they operate on a lot of protocol. But ASEAN has those things, but it isn't solely and dominantly composed of those things. So it is there are various levels of diplomacy to ASEAN. There is those kind of formal approaches, and then there are those, and we have also informal approaches, which I'll talk about later on. So it's a combination of approaches, but the important thing to understand here is why was this formula created, and a lot of it comes down to the context of Southeast Asia, the context of the nations involved. There is so much diversity even among the 5 member states, and even more so in the region at large. So what the formula seeks to do is to best accommodate the entirety of the diversity in the region, not to really privilege anyone or the other, but also but rather to seek to accommodate, compromise, to find points of consensus. I think that's really the key. So yeah, you can see here, through formal and informal mechanisms are founded on good interpersonal relations, in contrast to the Western organizations that revolve around rules-based formulas. I think the key thing that I want to highlight here on top of the informal mechanisms is the good interpersonal relations. I think one key thing about ASEAN is, and how ASEAN functions, is that the relationship between leaders, the elites of governance, so you're talking about the prime ministers, the presidents, the foreign ministers, and so on. The personal relationships among these leaders are also very important to the smooth functioning of ASEAN. And this is another level to their informal diplomacy, because even in the realm of diplomacy, even in the realm of something as formal as diplomacy, these kind of friendships matter. So there's friendships among nations, but there's also friendships among leaders, and there's always that kind of collegial spirit among the leaders of ASEAN. So ASEAN in itself, the terminology matters. The A in ASEAN stands for association, and that implies something loose. Now, I'm not saying that it is very half-hearted. I'm not saying that it's completely fragile. But association basically means a sense of looseness, in the sense that each state and each leader would have a good degree of autonomy within this regional organization, a good degree of independence of action within this organization. So nothing will be forced upon them, and in fact, a lot of their opinions and their perspectives and their views, their needs, their wants can be tabled at discussion, and there won't be a rushed decision. There won't be a rushed process to find a decision, or there won't be an imposition of wills, but everyone will talk it out and hopefully arrive at some sort of consensus. So at the end of the day, when I sum it all up, ASEAN is inspired by the UN. The UN is the formal international organization, is the foremost international organization, is the foremost multilateral grouping in the world at this point in time. There are many good things to learn from the UN and to be inspired after and to reference to. But ASEAN is not identical to the UN. There are certain modifications, especially with its processes and with its principles, that are unique to the region, that are contextualized to the region. Now, this slide is perhaps the most important slide of the entire set of slides today. It gives you the components itself of the ASEAN Way. What exactly is the ASEAN Way about? What exactly do the ASEAN members commit to when they signed the Bangkok Declaration in 1967? The first 3 over there are the most important: mutual respect for sovereignty, non-use of force, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of member states. Mutual respect for sovereignty, that is the baseline. Everyone needs to accept and respect each other's sovereignty. They also need to respect and accept international law, guaranteeing this sovereignty. Very, very crucial to Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia has been recently decolonized. Many states have just won their independence, and so sovereignty is something that everyone safeguards and will be highly, highly sensitive towards too. So any baseline any baseline principle to a regional organization needs to have this respect for sovereignty as its first point of agreement. The second thing is non-use of force. This one underscores the diplomatic approach that ASEAN has. its preference for diplomacy, peaceful settlement of disputes. Partly this is their preference for this approach. They are advocating for diplomacy. Partly also because at this point in time, no Southeast Asian country is able to commit to a regional military force. But I think the first thing is something we should focus more on, the fact that ASEAN wants to push for a diplomatic approach towards regional stability. Now, the third thing over here is non-interference. And non-interference in the domestic affairs of member states is perhaps the most controversial element of the ASEAN Way. Non-interference is in the domestic affairs of member states basically means that no member state can use the organization or use the organization platform to try to impose or try to talk about something to do with the domestic affairs of another member state. This is an extension of the principle of sovereignty, and at the regional level, at this ASEAN dialogue platform, you're meant to talk about regional issues. You should not talk about political developments within any country in the member state list, or you shouldn't talk about any issues going on within any of the member state countries. Because at this platform, you are meant to talk about things affecting the region as a whole or points of cooperation among members. Now, non-interference, it safeguards sovereignty. So what exactly is the controversy over here? The controversy over here lies with the fact that how do you tell, or how do you draw a distinct line between what is domestic and then what is regional? Because sometimes the domestic event can be so large or can be so complex that it affects the region as a whole. Then at that point in time, can you still talk about it? Give you an example, for instance, the Indonesian haze. In the Indonesian haze situation, it starts from Sumatra, right? And therefore it starts from Indonesia itself. But it affects Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, maybe even to some parts of Indonesia themselves, as well as to the Philippines. So what then do we classify this issue as? Is this still a domestic issue or is this a regional issue? I mean, Indonesia doesn't really want to table this at an ASEAN dialogue platform or any multilateral platform, while the rest of the countries, those affected by the haze, they want to talk about it because it affects them. So is this a regional issue? Is this not? And this is where non-interference kind of plays a part, and that's where the controversy comes in. Yeah, the last 2 points over there is what ASEAN seeks to do as well, pertaining to its processes. They want a regional approach to regional problems, and they want to have a comprehensive approach. Now, this comprehensive approach is quite interesting because what it seeks to do is that it seeks to blend a composite mix of strategies in order to deal with one single issue. So, for instance, if the issue is a security issue, they wouldn't just approach it in a military way, or they wouldn't just approach it in a security way, but they would seek to see how economics or how the social elements can play a part in helping to tackle this security issue. So another example, if it's an economic issue, same thing. They wouldn't just approach it from an economic perspective, but they would seek to study and perhaps implement how security strategies or political strategies or social strategies would also help in furthering this the development of this economic issue. So that's the comprehensive approach that ASEAN seeks to have. Another way to look at the ASEAN Way, these 3 R's, restraint, respect, and responsibility, is another framework for you to use if you want to conceptualize what the ASEAN Way is all about. A lot of it comes down to the same 3 principles that we saw earlier: respect sovereignty, non-use of force, as well as non-interference, together with the comprehensive approach to regional problems as well. The slide, the info on the slide over here that is quite important has to do with the 2 C's that you see over here: consultation and consensus. These are more of procedural kind of matters, how the actual process of the ASEAN Way. So a lot of the process of the ASEAN Way rests on consultation. It's a dialogue platform after all. And what does this consultation seek towards to? It seeks towards consensus. So just now I said that everyone kind of has a view, kind of has a perspective. Hopefully there can be a final point to all these views and perspectives where everyone can agree on. This is what we call consensus. Again, in theory, this is what the ASEAN Way is all about, but I think maybe on your minds right now, you can already see that there are some problems or some limitations or some inadequacies with the ASEAN Way. In the consensus-seeking fashion, you can see that while it's really good intended and it keeps everyone together, there's a good spirit of harmony and respect. But consensus-seeking approaches can take a really, really long time. And that's one of the core pillars of the criticisms of the ASEAN Way. The thing I want to introduce to you here, again to do with the process of the ASEAN Way, is these three things you can see in the first bullet point: track 1, track 1.5, and track 2. Earlier I said that ASEAN Way approaches are inspired by the UN, but are not exactly identical to the UN. So this is another way, this is a further example to see how that works out. Track 1 approaches are very formal approaches. They only involve government officials and usually government at a high level. And these are formal platforms and structures. So these are things like the ASEAN Summit or the Foreign Ministers meeting or the ministerial meetings and so on and so forth. So this level of meeting, track 1, only consists of government officials, government at a high level. So it's G2G kind of stuff. Track 1.5 is still being led and organized by government officials, but track 1.5 allows for non-governmental officials to also come into the picture. So for instance, if it's a security forum, the foreign minister, the defense minister, the prime minister can be there, but maybe also elements from the armed forces, or maybe security contractors, or maybe academics specializing in defense. Yeah, these non-government officials can also be there in these forums to dialogue with the government officials. And then track 2 approaches are where it's composed of situations or meetings where it's entirely made up of non-governmental officials. So those academics or those specialists or whatever it is, they come together, maybe even those economists, they come together by themselves without any government officials being there. They debate about an issue, they talk about it, maybe they'll produce a working paper, or maybe they'll produce some document or whatever. And this document, it actually serves a purpose because this document can travel its way up, back to track 1.5, and then finally back to track 1. So you can see it as sort of an experts meeting. And this, whatever findings that you get from these expert meetings, it can travel its way back to the government, and then it can be dialogued over there as well. So it's quite a multi-layered process. There are 3 tiers to this structure. ASEAN has a lot of track 1.5 and track 2 policies, and track 1.5, track 2 debating circles and platforms. So I think that's one of the key differences maybe between what we have over here and what's it like in the West. A lot of the relationship, a lot of the actual deals being made, or actual progress and all that, it's not exactly made at the track 1 forum. I think track 1 is more for an enunciation of what has been decided. How do they get to that point of the decision? A lot of it happens at the sidelines of formal meetings at track 1.5 and track 2 levels. But no matter which level you are at, I think all of it is guided by the ASEAN Way norms, the code of conduct, the behavior that they have towards one another. All of that is prescribed by the ASEAN Way norms. And so at the end of the day, the last point here, informal diplomacy. Informal diplomacy doesn't mean that it's very casual or it's very lackadaisical. It doesn't mean that. Informal diplomacy is just another form of diplomacy. It's another approach towards it, equally as important, because informal diplomacy can make meaningful relationships informal diplomacy can further the issue in very concrete and meaningful fashion. So these are some quotes about ASEAN Way, and you can take the time to read them yourself. But I want to end off with this last one over here. Um, One of the key things that I always stress and highlight is that when we judge an organization, or in this case, when we judge a set of principles, we have to judge the organization or the set of principles for what it seeks to achieve. We can never judge an organization based on our own imposed conceptions, right? We must take a look at what the organization sets out to do, and then we evaluate whether or not the organization reaches those goals. So let's take a look at this quote here. To be sure, ASEAN did not and could not resolve the Sabah dispute, right? I mean, nowhere does it state that it is meant as a resolution platform. It doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't have the legal mechanisms to do so, which continued to elude a decisive settlement, even till today, actually, in 2019. Nor did ASEAN play the role of conflict mediator or manager in a formal and legalistic sense. At that point in time, there weren't many legal structures, there weren't many structures in ASEAN as well. There weren't that kind of formalized procedural process towards conflict mediation. But ASEAN members, through direct and indirect measures of restraint, pressure, diplomacy, communication, and trade-offs, did succeed in preventing any further escalation of the crisis that might have led to armed hostilities and destroyed the organization. So the two goals that you see ASEAN fulfilling over there comes at the last sentence. They prevented any further escalation of the crisis, so they contained any points of conflict. And the second thing is prevent any destroying of the organization. So basically organizational survival. Now, ASEAN is that kind of regional organization. They seek to ensure regional stability. Now that is the key over here, because they're not meant as a conflict resolution in the legalistic sense. They're not meant as a conflict resolution platform, but they're meant to function as a dialogue platform, or maybe in certain cases they can be mediator towards the disputing parties, so that they would contain tensions and hopefully guide the two nations towards a point of resolution, either it is in ASEAN itself or maybe in another multilateral body. And so that's what ASEAN seeks to do. I think that when we judge an organization, let's take a look at what its objectives are, and then we evaluate. So at the end of the day, our key focus here would still be on the ASEAN Way, its effectiveness, whether or not it did help the organization fulfill its goals, or was it something that actually hindered the organization. Today we've looked a lot at the theory of the ASEAN Way, its components and its pillars, but across the next few weeks we are going to be looking at how the organization and how ASEAN Way manages the various security conflicts that are in Southeast Asia. So okay, thanks guys. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and let me know if you need any further clarification or whatever. Just arrange a consult with me. Okay, cool. Peace out. See y'all.